Hello and welcome. This is Eric Rodriguez, Director of Digital Marketing at CBI, and this is our webinar on demand, Data Loss Prevention, Why It's Overpromised and Underdelivered. I'm serving as your moderator today, and we are joined by our panelists, Nick Shadid, Senior Manager of Sales Engineering at Forcepoint, and Kurt Hardy, Director of Professional Services at CBI. We'll start with Kurt giving a quick intro on CBI.
Thanks, Eric. CBI, we have been around since 1991. And what we do is we provide a lot of different cybersecurity solutions for our organizations. And that may come in the form of penetration testing or assessments, all the way down to implementation of technology and controls within your environment. We pride ourselves in really being advisory led, and you'll see that as we go through this presentation. I'd like to turn it over to Nick as well to give a kind of a brief intro to Forcepoint as well.
Thanks, Kurt. Forcepoint as a brand has been around since 2016, but the technology itself dates back to the early 90s. Really, Forcepoint focuses at providing cybersecurity solutions around human-centric cybersecurity, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about what that means. But from a portfolio standpoint, Forcepoint has everything from web security and email security gateways to data loss prevention and user activity monitoring solutions, and all the way into behavior analytics.
All right, and for today's agenda, these are the topics we'll cover: common DLP concerns, alert fatigue, data classification and tagging, and data protection partnership. For now, I'll pass it back over to Kurt.
Good, thanks, Eric. And really, when we talk about DLP, or data protection, I should say, it's really all about making sure that we're aligning with the business and aligning with senior leadership on what they're looking for within a data protection solution. And a lot of times when IT is really leading the charge on that, it really becomes an overpromise of what DLP can bring to an organization, right? They talk about things about providing immediate value. Right out of the box, we'll be able to start blocking the bad and allowing the good. And we're experts at data protection. IT knows data and knows what data needs to be blocked and what doesn't. And a lot of times they won't go back into the business units and the different departments and really talk with them that really understand what type of data needs to be protected and to what level. Finally, I think one of the other overpromises is that the Security Operations Center can handle all these incidents, can handle these data protection incidents, are the best people to be able to actually handle those incidents and remediate them. When you're talking about these overpromises, there's quite a few different ways that we can overcome some of these challenges and really set expectations going forward. Really, when you're looking at it, you're looking at these data protection risks. You have your different attack vectors, your external attacker who is looking for your confidential data, potentially accidental loss, right? That well-meaning insider that is maybe just doing their job and that's just the way they know how to do it. And then you also have that malicious insider, right? These bad actors that are maybe trying to steal company data. And when you're looking at it, these are really the risks why you would get a DLP type solution or a data protection solution within the environment is to start blocking those bad actors or the well-meaning insider as well. The promise of it is that IT is going to be able to block all those guys and really with pinpoint accuracy find those external attackers that are exfiltrating data or the well-meaning insider and make sure that we're blocking it. What's really happening, right, is you're potentially blocking legitimate users when you're just standing up a DLP solution, doing default policy, default configuration, all that good stuff. You're going to start getting these false positives and false negatives as well. Blocking some bad, you're blocking some accidental loss, but you're also blocking regular users that are just trying to get their job done. It's really important to understand that when you deploy a DLP solution, it's not just plug it, set it, and forget it. It's really kind of making sure that you're aligning with the business and making sure that you're blocking the right types of behavior. When you start blocking the legitimate users, what do users start thinking? These are the people that you need to have buy-in into your data protection program to be able to progress and grow the program and become more mature and finally get to what you really want is start blocking the actual incidents. So the users start thinking you're basically blocking everything. Oh, IT security is added again with the data protection, with their DLP, with this agent they have, they're blocking me. And then the malicious insider is like, now I know how to get around it, right? They think that they're getting away scot-free. And so it really brings this misconception of data protection and what it means to the organization. They start looking at it as big brother. They start looking at this, and then the buy-in from the end user and the business units and the different departments starts to fail. Once that happens, your data protection program is basically going to go off the tracks. When you're looking at your data protection program, there's a few things that we see that are common concerns and common issues within an environment. Really, when you're talking about the underdelivery of a data protection solution, we really kind of start seeing these three different kind of common themes within the different environments that we're in. The first one is alert fatigue, where you're getting potentially too many alerts. You're getting those false positives or potentially even missing alerts altogether. When it comes to alert fatigue, it's really kind of understanding how the policies are crafted. And these next two really kind of play into getting rid of that alert fatigue and down to a manageable number of incidents that are truly incidents that we can start working with the business and the departments and bringing them into the data protection journey. Another problem that we see is really not starting with a data classification or tagging. Not even have a data classification policy in place to be able to start looking at how we're going to craft our DLP policies. Tagging data is excellent once you have your data classification. That way you can use that to detect across a variety of different security technologies. So utilizing data tags to be able to do that instead of relying on accurately describing data over and over again. We detect it that it's PHI data, we tag it, and then now it's PHI data. You don't have to go over and scan and redetect what that actually is. You're also doing detection a lot of times if you're not using a data classification solution or data classification or tagging. You're detecting it without user input. You're relying on the IT security policy administrator to be able to accurately describe data and put that in without reaching out to the business. That final point, right, kind of a theme of the other two as well, is not involving the business within your data protection journey. IT's potentially driving what our sensitive data definitions are. You get that perception that we saw in the previous slide about users not understanding data protection and see it more of as a big brother. And then it's also doing a disservice to the business where they don't really understand the risks that their actions and potentially faulty business process are doing to the organization. As we go through this, we'll talk about each of these three areas a little bit more in detail, and specifically how a solution like Forcepoint with their DLP technology can help combat some of these items as well. So first, we'll talk a little about alert fatigue. I don't even know if it's a quote, but it's a saying, right? The more you're exposed to something, the more you're going to tolerate it, normalize it, and then ultimately ignore it. And that's what we don't want to do. That's one of the main risks of alert fatigue, that you're going to miss or ignore alerts. You're going to have slow response time as well, because those alerts maybe take a lot of time to research because we don't know if this is an actual alert or not. And then finally, you're going to get burnout within these first responders to the actual incidents. When you're looking at that alert fatigue, it's really critical to understand that some of the default rules maybe are generating too many alerts. What you want to be able to do is start setting more intelligent policy, looking at different ways where you can combine different policies to be able to detect the data and be able to detect it in a more intelligent way. Looking at some advanced type rule sets instead of going with generating rules right out of the box, that you're taking these and making a continually path of improving these and making it more and more accurate. I think it's also important to set tiered alert priorities so that you understand a policy is triggered and maybe another policy is triggered. It starts escalating those alerts higher and higher. It's also important if you're using something like data classification, and if it triggers onto data classification, it doesn't really need to go through the rest of the rule set. We know that it's PHI, we know how to handle this data, we know if it's an alert or not. It's also important to make sure that those alerts are really actionable. We need to make sure that there's clear action plans on when this alert triggers for this business unit. Who do we need to notify? What's our incident response process as we go through this to make sure that we have these alerts that are coming in? We know the analyst, that first responder, whoever that may be, knows exactly what to do when that alert comes in. It's also important to consolidate redundant alerts. That same piece of PHI data doesn't trigger a PCI policy and doesn't trigger a described content that kind of looks like PHI, and it gets alerted down low, but it also gets alerted from the classification standpoint. So making sure that rules are inclusive of that data to make sure that it's catching it, but also to make sure that it's not creating a double alert, and making sure that your policy set within a tool like Forcepoint has that ability to kind of look at those alerts differently. To prioritize this continuous review and improvement, make sure that there's a feedback cycle from the business units and the users out there that will allow for such things as exceptions, but also to help you describe data better, to be able to look at some advanced rule sets of identifying data and making sure that you're continually improving those, and not necessarily just, hey, we're setting these policies and forgetting them. Make sure that there's that continuous review process to understand what we can do with the policy sets, what we can do with the tool as well.
Yeah, very accurate description of the problem we face with alert fatigue. You know, at Forcepoint, we kind of see alert fatigue from every single DLP customer. And really, there's two main reasons for that. There's really, or two ways to kind of simplify those alerts. The obvious answer for a lot of people is, well, let's throw some tools at the problem and see if we can't automate the reply to the incident, or maybe automate the analysis of the incident, things like that. But I think a lot of people also discount kind of the upfront approach, or the taking the time at the beginning of the data protection program to really understand the business drivers and the tool sets and functionality that are included with the DLP tool to be able to use it in a more robust and very streamlined fashion. So on this slide here, I've got a couple of the items from a DLP policy framework, and I'll go through two of the examples here in a second. But on the left side, we've got a list of kind of an in development DLP policy framework. When you're going through and you're building out your DLP policies and understanding, how you're going to apply them to your users and your data. Some of the common issues we see on the left, and some of the more advanced or mature ways to approach those on the right here. So the first point there, just the unfamiliarity of DLP features and common classifiers, or, types of data you can look at. Many DLP tools have a robust set of features, including file fingerprinting or database fingerprinting for exact data matching. And a lot of people, would want to start with your simple compliance rules and things like that. And so, using some of those more advanced features up front can also streamline the alerts that you get and ensure that you're really only looking for the data types that you're, really concerned about leaving the organization. If you also, Kurt brought up, having a single set of policies applied to all users. I think this is probably the single biggest issue when it comes to, multiple alerts for the same thing, or the single biggest reason why there are so many alerts. Proper use of policy levels and exceptions. A lot of people don't even know that there are ways to do policy levels, and this is something that we're going to get into here in a second. And then, a lot of people are afraid to block there. We stick things in a monitor only mode and never really get to a blocking mode, with the DLP toolset, which is, something that most people strive for. And I think sometimes that's something that businesses aren't really willing to do because of the amount of alerts and the amount of effort it takes on the analyst side, to really implement a really solid DLP program. Yeah, I think an important point to make here as well is there's not a overarching single approach for constructing and organizing policies. It is going to be organizational dependent. It's going to be dependent on your region, as well as kind of your industry, things like that. The point here I want to make is it's important to be consistent. So if you're going to apply DLP policies in a certain way, every time you go to add or remove or change those policies, you want to take the same methodology when you're going through and making those changes. And so we'll jump into the next slide and one of our specific examples here. This is the DLP Policy Framework that Forcepoint utilizes here. And on the left there in the screenshot, you have an example of different types of policies. And as you see, numbered from 1 through 7, we have different levels. The important thing here is these operate as a firewall rule would. So in most DLP products and tool sets, you pick a policy and you apply that policy to a specific person or a specific group of people, and then you move on to the next policy. Well, in the Forcepoint DLP world, you can do that and then stop processing rules after that violation is found. So in this case here, if we have a rule set in section number 1 and we hit or trigger on that policy, we're not going to go through and continue on scanning that same set of data for policy violations in the rest of these 6 groups. Now, this is very important to reduce alerts because you can also tier the most important policies that you have. And talking about data classification as well, a lot of people and a lot of companies that have data classification and tagging enabled can really, have a good starting point to start at level 1 with those simple classification-based policies, and then roll into some of the more complex ones like exact data matching and some of the other Social Security and PCI policies there. Another thing that we see a lot as well to reduce alert fatigue and exceptions is create specific rules for each channel that you're going to monitor, and that way your exception group policies are a little easier to manage. So on the right there, you see we've got Social Security number policy and PCI policy, and those are broken out by the channel that you want to monitor. In most cases, you're not going to want to monitor all of the channels for those specific data types, so you can pick and choose and simplify your policies and your exceptions by only adding in the channels that you're going to monitor for that specific data. So that's one way that you can reduce the alerts and the overhead for managing DLP policies. One of the things that we can also do is a DLP Data Grid. And this is very important for a lot of the non-technical staff, some of the business owners for the organization. Very simple. You identify the types of data that you're going to look at, which is highlighted in the big blue bars there. And then on the left side, you've got specific data types underneath those larger themes. And then you basically have your channels as we go, and you lay out, exactly what you want to happen for each of those channels from an action plan standpoint. This gives you a good view into, your entire DLP policy framework. And it also gives you a real quick ability to show business owners kind of what would happen if, a person in a specific department, for example, date of birth information, the email channel, and what would happen there. So taking the time up front to really go through and plan out your DLP policy framework and using those policy levels are very effective ways to reduce the amount of alerts that you'll get and provide you with alerts that are very specific and something that you're going to want to take action on.
Thanks, Nick. I think that the next issue on our list about data classification and not using it, it really helps with that alert fatigue. So Thomas Mann, he said, you ask what is the use of classification? It's really the order and the simplification, the first steps toward the mastery of the subject. If you want to master data protection and really look at how do we do this in the best way, how do we detect data in the best way, data classification is really that answer. That actual enemy is unknown, and being able to pick the needle out of the haystack instead of knowing exactly where that needle is and ordering it, and we put it in this nice little box and we label it and we say, hey, the needles go here. It's more about being able to label that data and being able to take action on it. When you see what's underdelivered on this is that you're just using the described content. You're looking for that needle in the haystack each and every time to be able to detect against it, describing that content, right? It has something that looks like a Social Security number. It's got something that looks like a date of birth, all that different things. But the risk of it is you're, again, going back to those false positives. You're alienating those users by classifying data incorrectly. And you're not going to be able to describe with consistency the different types of data. You need to be able to have this data classification and particularly tagging as well, to be able to have tools like Forcepoint pick up on that and take the appropriate action. So the solve for this really is you're allowing your users to participate in data classification. So Forcepoint has a great integration with Bold and James. It really allows users to participate in data classification. So it has the ability to integrate with Bold and James so that as a user is creating a document or manipulating a document, it has the ability to use Forcepoint type rules to be able to help guide users on how to actually classify that data and how to tag it with the Bold and James integration. It also gives you the ability to enforce that security policy and controls using that data classification tag, so that I know I can't send PHI data, for example, over email to an external user without encryption. We have the ability to start enforcing those controls based upon the classification tag. You also have the ability to, outside of DLP, is using that tag and other security controls, or just data governance in general, and being able to look at where your data resides within the network so that you can better protect it, or that you can use that tag to help with your backup strategy. We understand where this confidential data is. It's more important to back up this data than other types of data. It really starts giving the data classification business value of where that data is. It helps you demonstrate compliance, create security culture, safer collaboration with the controls that we have in place, and it really increases the business value that you have when it comes to data protection. I also think it's important to tie these topics that we talk about back to some industry advice, right? So I use this slide a lot. This is Forrester's Data Security and Control Framework. They're number one. Starting your data protection journey is really helping define what your data is. And they start with data classification and data discovery and start tagging data to make it easier to control. Once you do that, you have that ability to look at how users are using data within the environment and start dissecting that so that you can understand what the business value of that data is, but also to start intelligently creating defenses around your confidential data. And then finally, it gets down to that defend. Now that we have all this data, now that we've defined our data classification, now that we've tagged our data, what do we actually do with it, right? So making sure that right users have the right access, that you're detecting and potentially blocking data usage outside of normal process, or disposing of data that's no longer needed. Encryption is another one where you have the ability to take action on this data, encrypt it going out via email, or encrypt it when it goes to USB drive, that sort of thing. When we talk about this kind of a game plan of going after a DLP type tool or a data protection within a data protection program, it's really key to understand the role that classification and potentially data tagging come into play when you're looking at how do we start our data protection journey. So I'd like to turn it over to Nick as well to talk a little bit about this and how Forcepoint sees data classification and how it fits into the data protection journey.
Thanks, Kurt. I'm going to take one step back a little bit before I get into data classification specifically, because it's one of those questions that we always ask clients and partners, and it's a very important one. And I have an interesting way that I think about it as well. So before we get into classification specifically, a lot of what we talk about with our clients is not necessarily for the capability of a DLP tool or where it fits into a data protection program, but really, how are you going to plan the implementation, right? Once you've got the tool set, once you understand the capabilities, really, how do you go about then deploying that in the most effective way? And also, go ahead and include the surrounding third-party technologies that are going to help assist with that rollout there. So on the left there, we've got a basic implementation schedule based on essentially the rate of occurrence and the impact to the business. Now, this is something that is obviously different for every organization. Every organization tends to start in different places, but I think the number one thing that people understand is really, what are my data assets? What is my crown jewels? What are the types of data that I really want to approach protection on? And then how do I fit a phased rollout in there? So On the right, some of the questions that a lot of times we get asked, right? Why do we recommend a phased approach? I think that pretty much is self-explanatory based on some of the alert fatigue that we talked about earlier. The next two kind of go together, really. Which of the 4 DLP controls in motion, in use, cloud, or at rest should you implement first and why? And then, where does the data classification piece fit into that strategy? And then another question that comes up a lot is, how long should implementation take from when I start, planning to go ahead and, actually impacting and blocking the business? The most common implementation schedule that, we have seen at Forcepoint utilizing Bolden James to get very specific on the phases and the rollout here. I think a very common misconception about data classification and tagging of data is that it has to be done first before you step into DLP. While that is kind of like an ideal scenario, a lot of companies are starting data protection programs late, or they've had one that's been in place that hasn't been effective. And you can really streamline, the implementation here if you can use data classification and data loss prevention almost like a check and balance, if you will. This is kind of an ideal path that we've presented and been very, very successful with a number of clients here. And since classification and DLP endpoint, or the in-use types of data, are really the most common and most robust of the DLP options, it really helps you not only identify and classify what data is being accessed, but you can also help the users get used to having and using the classification tool, while at the same time checking what they do with endpoint data arrest scans and verifying that the tags that they're applying are actually the tags that should be applied to that data. We generally see phase 1 be a 2 to 3 month approach, really help streamline those policies and everything like that. And then phase 2, 3, and 4 really are just additions to different enforcement points, and it really streamlines the implementation, so where you can go from phase 1 all the way to phase 4 in a 4 to 6 month time frame for an enterprise organization. And you'll notice there, and people might ask, why data arrest scanning at the very end? Because we don't know where our data is, we don't know what type of data it is, and that kind of stuff. That's always a good question. A lot of people also like to start by scanning the data up front. And the question I always ask is, well, you've scanned all the data, now what? Right? You still have people accessing it, you still have people using it. You don't know where it's going, you don't know what is leaving and what's not being touched, that kind of stuff. So you start getting into some of the data governance side of the house there, not necessarily the data protection side. And we can be much more effective by, taking the approach of the in-use side, because then you get a better idea of what data is actually moving around the organization. I'm going to walk you through real quick, the data, DLP and classification, and kind of how they work together to really take classification to the next level. The first thing, or number one here, utilizing Forcepoint DLP and Bolden James is, the Bolden James side, right? You got to configure your labels. You have to set discovery action plans. One of the things you can do on the endpoint with Forcepoint endpoint is go ahead and scan an endpoint file system and identify what data is living there as well. A very easy integration and place to start the scanning process is to utilize that. Moving into the second piece of this, once you have Bolden James policies configured and set, you can also include the users in the creation of new data, using things like an Office classifier or a SharePoint classifier. When users are actually starting to create documentation on their machines, or they're sending emails out, you can use the Bolden James tool set to interact with the user, recommend labels, classify the content based on the schema that you've come up with as a business. And then once you do that, you can move into the third part of this, where the Forcepoint system can, warn, hey, are you sure that this is the proper classification level? We've scanned the data, we looked at it, we thought it was confidential, but you've got it set to public. Like, are you sure that this is the type of data that you want? Again, checks and balances between, the data protection side and and the classification side. And once you've kind of rolled through those three things, you can really get into the more intelligent side of things, where, if someone sends out a file that's not labeled, well, the DLP system, because it understands the labeling and the schema that you have, we'll go ahead and apply that label automatically, right? We know that these are social security numbers. We know that these are supposed to be set as confidential. We'll go ahead and apply that label and apply the appropriate DLP action to that. and then move ahead and let you guys know what we did, and also let the user know, hey, this is data that you shouldn't have sent out, and this is the reason why. And then the last thing there is you can also directly interact with the user on the endpoint. Very similar. You can notify or protect the user from that specific action that they took. And there's a number of different other actions that you can take there as well. So using both the tools together really, again, as a check and balance, makes the data classification and tagging process, one, much more involved from the user side, but also a little more streamlined as well.
Thanks, Nick. This next section, I want to talk a little bit about the ways that we can start involving the business a little bit better into a data protection environment in your program, in your policies, and in your DLP solution. Out in the field, we see a lot of times where, again, it's that underdelivered of the DLP solution where IT relies on the business to help with the data protection policies. But the business side really doesn't understand data protection, how IT understands data protection from the technology perspective. And it's that translation of the data protection capability back to the business leaders that it doesn't really happen in a great fashion. So the business really doesn't know how to articulate a DLP policy. A lot of times this becomes frustrating from the business demands on IT, frustration on IT's part with the business demands, right? So the business is telling me I got to do this, but I can't really do this because it doesn't really work that way, all that stuff. And it becomes then IT starts driving those data protection decisions really kind of without business input or without true buy-in from the business. In IT coming up with what actually PHI is or what exactly is PII within the organization. And they're not really the best people to do that. And so really the solve for that is to really combine business and IT and make sure that they're involving those business leaders in the data protection committee. And so setting up an actual committee within the organization that helps drive those data protection decisions. And so this really must have really a partnership with the business to promote those policies and those safe data handling procedures and really start getting on and looking at some of the metrics and risk decisions and risks and incidents and all of that good stuff that we're reporting both those positives and negatives within that committee so that they can take that information, be aware of it, and really start providing guidance to their users to be able to take better actions and make more intelligent security and safe data handling decisions. And so really the scope of that, the data protection committee comes that policy and procedure, user awareness and acceptance and promotion of the DLP or the data protection program in general, and really looking at how a Forcepoint DLP can provide metrics that really relate back to different business units and being able to look at some of those and also provide that ability to do exception into the rule and write them into the DLP type rules. And so the data protection committee is really there to drive the policy goals, the governance, and that adoption within the organization. It's really key for this data protection committee to include senior business leadership. It's got to have some component of HR and legal. IT security obviously has to be in it, as well as compliance and audit. And really this committee or this group, they got to meet regularly, being able to look intelligently at the data that's coming out of a DLP type solution. Again, going into that dissect and analyze portion of the Forrester model and being able to look at how we're using data within the environment, what a DLP policy needs to look like, what type of safe handling procedures that we need to be able to come up with, and making sure that we're defining DLP policy against those procedures, those safe data handling procedures. We're just continually looking at these DLP policies, the feedback from the end users, from exception processes, looking at potential false positives and how we can solve that a little bit better, and looking at the DLP policy in general and making sure that it's aligning with company goals. I think another main benefit of this is as you're looking at this data and dissecting it, you're going to see gaps in your safe data handling procedures, potentially a secure file transfer, or we share data with this organization all the time via email. Potentially there's an option for like a VPN or a little bit more secure way of transferring that data back and forth. And so it allows you to see these gaps and allows you to start implementing improvement measures so that the data handling techniques that the businesses use are safe and secure. They also provide kind of the governance portion of it is really key as well. So providing oversight of the policies, procedures, and the execution of those procedures for data security as well. This data protection committee really is designed to kind of get business and IT in the room together to be able to share the business's experiences with the data protection solution and really start crafting the data protection goals and policies within an organization, and being able to take that back to the actual employees and start talking with them significantly about how they're handling data, how they should be handling it correctly, and promoting those secure data handling procedures. When you're looking at it, when you're looking at the data, that data protection committee and this kind of marriage between IT security and business, it's definitely hard to be able to do that, and being able to have that level of expertise with the tools, and also from a strategic perspective, making sure that you have that common vision and common framework with the business. Turn it over to Nick for a little bit more about that from a Forcepoint perspective.
Thanks, Kurt. And this specific slide, not necessarily Forcepoint specific, but again, working in the DLP space for the past 10 plus years, some of the methodology and execution of a data protection program, as well as the committee behind it, is kind of some of the things that are overlooked. So we've put together here a couple of solid questions to ask if you're standing up a DLP program or a data protection program. What are the the business drivers, and then on the right side there, you can dig in a little deeper even on what risks are we trying to mitigate with this data protection program, right? So what data do we own? What's most critical to the business, to our brand, to our customers, to our reputation, things like that. How do you involve the data owners and the people that are going to be involved with these decisions, right? There's a lot of people are and should be involved, and obviously getting their buy-in is tough in most cases. So just a couple of thoughts and ideas for you to work through as you build out data protection programs, or you go ahead and modify your own to get a little more out of the program as you move forward and mature in the technology space. We're going to move into bring it all back together. As we talked about earlier, the alert fatigue and some of the things we can do up front to prevent alerts. We kind of want to get into what Forcepoint has deemed the next generation for data protection, or dynamic data protection. What else could we do after we've got the committee set up, we've gone through our questions, we've done the interviews, we've come up with a good DLP implementation schedule, we've rolled out a solid set of tools and policies, and we've narrowed down our scope, and we're very effective with the current data protection program from a standard DLP and classification standpoint. Well, what's next? How can we get even better? How can we get more modern with the tool set and the technology? And what else could we add to the mix to make things a little more automated or a little better for the team here? So if you look here on this slide in the middle, we've got people, we've got channel, we've got data. At the heart of any DLP program, those things are very important, as we've discussed. And on the left there, what you'll notice is endpoint incidents and endpoint events. From a DLP standpoint, one of the reasons why alerts are hard to triage, as we talked about earlier, is they lack a lot of context. You can get the who, you can get the what, you can get the where, you can get the time, you can get the date, all that fun stuff. But the thing that's missing is the context. And a lot of times, the difference between a violation or just an accidental or non-violation is the context around why somebody was doing something. Back to the personas that Kurt had gone through earlier. Someone might be doing something that they don't know is wrong, but it's not necessarily a risk to the business if they're doing it for the right reason. So how do we take that and we translate it to the technology here? The key there is the behavior analytics standpoint. And what Forcepoint has done has really taken the behavior analytics, which includes the 5 different scenarios you see at the bottom there, and we've focused on the data exfiltration scenario. And we've specifically integrated it with DLP to use some of those endpoint events on the left to provide extra context to the DLP system and allow it to understand why somebody is doing something, and then takes action appropriately based on a risk level and an action plan that you've set that we're going to get into in a second. And so, the key takeaways from this are become almost a closed loop architecture where the DLP system and the behavior analytics are working together to automate policies, to improve the investigation efficacy of the alerts that are provided by the DLP system. And you're also reducing the false positives, because if you understand what or why somebody is doing a specific event and you understand the risk associated with that event, then you can really tell if that person is being risky to the business or they just need additional education. And the way we do this, like we mentioned, adding that additional context when you're on the endpoint. So on the left there, you'll see the DLP system. We're doing endpoint monitoring and collection from the data and use standpoint. We're also doing the enforcement of specific action plans and specific channels for blocking and things like that. And what we do then is we send that contextual information and the DLP incidents over to our behavior analytics system, and we have the analytics system work on some data models that are specifically tuned for the DLP events and the collections that we're providing to determine what type of risk a user is going to have on the business. And so when you get things like website visits or email context, you can start to look for things like flight risks or other types of data exfiltration scenario issues, and you can really get a good understanding of what those users are doing and why. And when you know that stuff, you can then set a dynamic enforcement action plan based on risk level to the business. Once you get there, you can take the top section there where we used to have a specific action plan for a specific rule, and that was all that we could have. And then now we're going down to the bottom there where you can set different types of actions based on a risk level of the user. So really what you're doing there is you're enhancing the capability of a DLP tool, which traditionally has, a one-to-many approach. And now you're taking that approach and you're changing it and you're making it a one-to-one approach. So when you think about that and think about the rule sets that you have in traditional DLP tools, imagine having a specific rule for every single user on your environment. It would be, overhead nightmare and things like that. But now you can set a single rule, and that rule will apply differently based on the user's risk level. You've basically simplified that, and you've made it something that can be consumed by any business with the right context and the right approach to data protection. This is something that we've done over the past couple of years, and that we rolled out last year. It's been extremely successful, in terms of helping with that alert fatigue and really streamlining responses to data loss prevention or data protection incidents, and then also giving additional context so that the security analysts understand the why, and they can really start to investigate those specific events that are going to cause harm to the business, and really helps to make the DLP even more effective as a programmatic tool, not just a technology tool.
With that, we will conclude today's DLP webinar. I'd like to take a moment to thank Kurt Hardy from CBI and Nick Shadid from Forcepoint for your time and expertise. And of course, CBI would like to extend its thanks to Forcepoint for your partnership. And of course, I'd like to take a moment to thank you, the audience, for signing in to view our webinar on demand. If you have any questions or if you would like to request a DLP assessment, please contact us and we will be glad to follow up promptly. Thanks again. Have a great day.